My name is Michelle, and growing up, the difference between my twin sister Jessica and me was like night and day. She was the golden child, and I was not. Our dad, a stern university professor, was always buried in books and lectures, while our mom was the quintessential housewife, focused on home and family, urging us to follow her example. From as early as I can remember, being at home felt like an endless critique session. My parents had a blueprint for the perfect family, and it didn't include a daughter who wore band t-shirts and preferred her own company. "Michelle, why can't you be more like your sister?" was my mom's favorite line, usually hurled at me when I showed up at breakfast with headphones on, trying to block out the world. Jessica, on the other hand, basked in the glow of their approval. "I just don't get why it's so hard for you to put on a nice dress and smile more," she'd say, flipping her perfect hair over her shoulder. It felt like she was from a different planet. One particularly tough Saturday, as our family got ready for one of Dad's faculty parties, a total snooze fest, but a mandatory event for us, I decided to rebel in the smallest way I knew how. I put on my darkest eyeliner and a pair of boots that definitely didn't meet the acceptable standard. "You're not going out like that, are you?" Mom caught me on the stairs, her eyes glaring at my boots as if they were coated in mud. I shrugged, my usual defense. "Don't see why not." She sighed, that long, drawn-out kind that screamed, "You are the biggest disappointment in my perfectly organized world." "Please, Michelle, just this once, can't you try to fit in?" "What for? So you can pretend we're the perfect family?" I shot back, tired of the same old argument. "It's not about pretending," she argued, her voice taking on that sharp edge that meant business. Jessica, overhearing the exchange, came trotting down the hallway, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor like a judge approaching the bench. "Mom's right, Amy. It's not that hard to look decent. Why do you always have to make things difficult?" "I don't want to be a clone of you, Jessica," I snapped, feeling my face flush with anger. I hated these arguments, hated being compared, but more than anything, I hated feeling like the odd one out in my own home. Dad appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his brow furrowed. "Michelle, go change. Now. We're leaving in 15 minutes, he said firmly. His tone left no room for argument. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. The disappointment in his eyes was enough to send me marching back to my room to swap my boots for plain flats and wipe away half my eyeliner. As we drove to the party, the car was silent except for the classical music Dad insisted on playing because it was calming. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past. In that moment, I promised myself that someday I'd live a life where no one could tell me what to wear, how to act, or who to be. Someday, I'd be free from these suffocating expectations. My room was the only corner of the house where I could truly breathe. Unlike the rest of the house, filled with my parents' carefully curated choices, my room was mine. It wasn't much, just 4 walls covered in sketches and music posters. But it was my escape from the reality of my family's expectations. One evening, as I was trying to lose myself in a playlist of my favorite bands, Dad knocked and marched into my room, his face set in a familiar frown. "Michelle, turn that noise down. And why haven't you studied with Jessica today? You know you both have exams coming up," he said, his voice stern. I pulled out one earbud and looked up at him, trying to keep my voice calm. "I have been studying, just not with Jessica. I learn better on my own." Dad shook his head, clearly not believing me. "You know the rules. Your sister gets good grades, and you should be doing the same. I don't see why you always have to make things difficult." "It's not about making things difficult," I said, feeling my frustration grow. "I just don't see why I have to do everything Jessica's way. Can't I have my own way of studying?" He didn't respond to that. He just switched to another complaint. "And those friends of yours, I saw you with them at the cafe yesterday. I don't think they're a good influence. You should be spending time with the daughters of my colleagues. They're more suitable." I felt my temper rising. Suitable for what? For you? Because they talk about economics and pretend to enjoy those boring university gatherings? Before he could answer, Mom appeared at the doorway, her voice sharp. "Michelle, your father is right. Those girls are from good families. They know how to behave. They're the kind of friends you should want. I stood up, facing both of them. What if I don't want friends who are picked for me? What if I want to choose my own friends, choose what I study, or even decide what I want to be? That's enough, Michelle, Mom said firmly. You know your future is with the university. Your father has made sure of that. And after you graduate, you'll need to start thinking about settling down. We've already discussed this. Settling down. The words felt like a prison sentence. You mean thinking about being someone's wife, like Jessica? Is that all you think I'm meant for? Mom's face softened a bit, but her voice stayed firm. We want what's best for you. Following the path we've set out will give you a good life. A good life, I repeated, the irony bitter in my mouth. Is it a good life if it's someone else's idea of good? No one answered. They didn't need to. We all knew there was no point in arguing. They had their plans, and they expected me to follow them, just like Jessica. Jessica and I were like two sides of the same coin, always together, but never on the same page. At the university where Dad taught, the differences between us became even clearer. She was into business management, the golden child, always nodding along in lectures and asking those insightful questions that made professors smile. Me? I was stuck in the same program, but it felt like wearing a shoe on the wrong foot. Awkward, uncomfortable, and just plain wrong. One afternoon, as I was struggling through a pile of textbooks in the library, Jessica breezed in, her notes organized, her smile ready. Hey, Amy, you coming to the study group tonight? Professor Hall mentioned he might drop by. It could be good for us to show up, she said, her tone light but insistent. I glanced up, feeling the weight of her expectations. No, I don't think so. Those things aren't really my scene, you know. She frowned, putting her books down with a thud that matched her disapproval. It's not about it being your scene, Amy. It's about making the right impressions. You need to start taking this seriously. We're graduating soon. I shrugged and turned back to my notes. I am taking it seriously, just not in a way that makes me unhappy. Why should I pretend? Because, Amy, sometimes you have to play the game to get ahead, she said, waving at her neat textbooks and color-coded notes. It's not about liking it, it's about doing what's necessary. I shook my head and pushed my chair back with a scrape. Well, maybe I'm tired of doing what's necessary according to everyone else. Did you ever think of that? Her voice softened, but her eyes were still firm. Amy, I'm just trying to help you. Dad won't always be around to fix things. What will you do if you keep pushing everyone away? Maybe I'll figure it out on my own. Maybe I don't need to follow Dad's path. Or yours, I replied, feeling a surge of defiance. Jessica sighed, clearly frustrated. You're so stubborn. Just try, okay? For me, if not for yourself. Show up tonight and talk to Professor Hall. It won't kill you. I looked at her, really looked, and saw not just my perfect sister, but someone who cared, in her own way. Fine, I'll think about it, I conceded, not ready to promise more. Thank you, she said, her smile returning. It's not that bad, you know. You might even like it if you gave it a chance. Doubt it, I muttered, but I knew I had lost this round. For Jessica, I'd show up, sit through another boring discussion, and nod at the right times. It was just a few hours. How bad could it be? As it turned out, not as bad as I thought. Professor Hall was surprisingly interesting when he wasn't lecturing from a podium. I even asked a question, which earned a shocked but pleased look from Jessica. Later, as we walked back to our dorm, Jessica nudged me. See? Not so terrible, right? That fragile piece didn't last long. In our final year, Jessica introduced us to her fiancé, a lawyer 12 years older, already well-established, and exactly what our parents dreamed of. Mom and Dad were thrilled, praising Jessica for making such a smart choice. Then they turned their hopeful eyes on me. Now, Michelle, it's your turn to find someone suitable, Dad said one evening over dinner, his tone implying my time was running out. Mom nodded enthusiastically, already planning out my life as if it were another one of her well-organized projects. Think about your future, dear. Someone who can provide for you, who has a good standing. I remember staring at my plate, feeling trapped. Jessica's wedding was planned down to the smallest detail by Mom, from the bridesmaids' dresses to the flowers. Everything showcased her perfect vision of family prestige. After the wedding, Mom often visited Jessica, giving advice and making sure Jessica's life went exactly as she had planned. Watching this, I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want my life controlled by someone else. One day, I was walking down the street, lost in thoughts about escaping the life my parents had planned for me, when I heard the deep rumble of a motorcycle. Curiosity made me look up. That's when I saw him. Brian, with his leather jacket and carefree smile, pulled up beside me. "You look like you need a ride," he called over the roar of the engine, a playful sparkle in his eyes. I hesitated, looking back toward the path home, then at his outstretched hand. What did I have to lose? "Sure, why not?" I said, my voice a mix of nerves and excitement. Climbing onto the back of his bike, I felt a rush of adrenaline as we sped away. The wind whipped through my hair, and for the first time in a long while, I laughed, a real laugh. Brian shouted something about showing me his world, and I held on tighter, not wanting the moment to end. We stopped at a diner popular with bikers. Over burgers and fries, Brian told me about his life as a welder, his love for bikes, and his passion for the open road. It was so different from anything I was used to, raw and real. "Don't you get scared living like this?" I asked, my voice barely rising above the clatter of plates and chatter around us. "Scared? No, it's thrilling. You never know what's around the corner. Isn't that better than having everything planned out for you?" he replied, his eyes lighting up with each word. Over the next few weeks, we met in secret. Each ride on Brian's motorcycle took me further from the life I was supposed to live and closer to the life I craved. The speed, the adventure. It wasn't just about the thrill. It was about feeling alive, feeling free. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a secluded overlook, Brian turned to me. "Michelle, I don't just ride to escape. I ride to feel alive, to make every moment count. With you, every moment feels like it's worth something." I leaned into him, my heart beating fast. "I've never felt like this before. You make me feel free, Brian." He smiled, pulling me closer. "Then let's not go back to just existing. Let's live." 5 months with Brian felt like a lifetime of moments I had always dreamed of. The day he proposed was under the stars, with the gentle rumble of his bike in the background. My heart said yes before my mouth could form the word. It was perfect, except for one big problem: my parents. I was terrified to introduce Brian to them. He was everything they disapproved of: his rough edges, his wild spirit, his simple but happy life as a welder. But love gave me courage, and I decided it was time for them to know. The day I brought Brian home, he wore his usual leather vest, red t-shirt, ripped jeans, and a bandana. I loved that about him. He was always himself. As we walked up the driveway, I could already feel the weight of my parents' judgment. When we stepped inside, Mom's face went pale at the sight of Brian, her eyes widening in shock. "What in the world, Michelle?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Dad's reaction was harsher, his words sharp as knives. "Who is this? And why is he dressed like a thug in our house?" I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. "Mom, Dad, this is Brian. He's the man I love. We're getting married." The silence was deafening. Then Dad turned to Brian, his tone full of disdain. "Married? What do you do for a living, young man? What are your qualifications?" Brian, bless him, didn't waver. "I'm a welder. I took some specialized courses after high school. I work hard and make an honest living." The look on my parents' faces was a mix of horror and disbelief. Mom looked like she might faint. "A welder? Michelle, you can't be serious." Dad's voice rose, anger flaring. "You expect us to bless this? To throw away your future for a welder?" I felt my resolve harden. "Yes, because he makes me happy. Isn't that what should matter?" But the life you'll lead, Mom started, her voice trembling. It will be the life I choose, I shot back, my own voice gaining strength. Dad shook his head, his decision clear. We cannot and will not support this. If you choose him, don't expect to be a part of this family. The finality in his tone broke my heart, but not my decision. Brian squeezed my hand, giving me the strength to face them. Then I choose Brian. I choose us. I choose my happiness. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and Dad's jaw clenched tight. If you walk out with him, don't bother coming back, Dad said, his voice cold. Walking away from my parents' house with Brian, my heart was a mess of emotions. Pain, relief, excitement, and fear all mixed into one. The night air felt different, like each breath was a new beginning as I took a step further into a new life. We rode in silence for a while, the steady roar of the motorcycle beneath us. When we finally stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, Brian turned to me with a serious look. Are you sure about this, Michelle? I mean, really sure? There's no going back after tonight, he said, his eyes searching mine for any sign of doubt. I nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. I've never been more sure of anything. Being with you feels right. It feels like what I'm meant to do. He smiled that reckless, charming smile that had won me over the first day we met. All right then, let's do it. Let's start our life together. Inside the diner, we found a quiet booth in the corner. The waitress brought us 2 coffees without asking, and we sat there, planning our next steps. So, what's first? I asked, stirring cream into my coffee and watching it swirl. We'll need to find a place to stay, at least for a while, and maybe look for jobs. I have some buddies who can help us get started, Brian replied, sounding practical but hopeful. It's going to be tough, isn't it? I said, more as a statement than a question. The reality of what we were doing was starting to sink in. Brian reached across the table and covered my hand with his. It might be, but we'll handle it together. Tough is nothing new for either of us, right? I couldn't help but laugh, a short, genuine burst of amusement. Right. Together. We spent hours in that diner, talking and planning. Every so often, Brian would mention an idea that sounded so wild and free that it made my heart jump. And maybe one day, we'll save enough to take that road trip across the country. Just you, me, and the open road. I like that, I said, allowing myself to dream bigger than I ever had. Riding back into the city, we began our search. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. We found a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. Brian found work at a local garage, and I picked up shifts at a nearby diner. Life was hard, but it was ours. We made do with what we had, and every night when we came home to each other, it felt like we had everything. Months later, we decided it was time to make it official and got married in a small, intimate ceremony. I held on to a small hope that my family would show up, that they would see how happy I was and let go of their prejudices. But the chairs we had reserved for them stayed empty, and no congratulatory messages came. Despite the sting of their absence, the day was perfect because it was ours. Over time, I grew very close to Brian's mom. She welcomed me with open arms, calling me her daughter and filling in the gaps left by my own family. Her warmth and acceptance helped heal some of the wounds left by my parents' rejection. Things finally started looking up for Brian and me after he completed some additional training and became a certified underwater welder. His income shot up to $230,000 a year. That change made a huge difference. We managed to buy a townhouse in a nice area, the kind of place I had always dreamed about, but never thought I'd actually live in. I started working as a dispatcher in Brian's company. It wasn't just a job. It felt like I was part of something important, supporting the man I loved in building our future together. On weekends, we escaped the city on his bike, roaring through winding roads and taking in the breathtaking views of nature. Those moments, with the wind in my hair and Brian's warmth against my back, were pure bliss. Living nearby, my mother-in-law became a frequent visitor. One afternoon, while Brian was tinkering in the garage and I was making coffee, she arrived looking a bit troubled. "There's been some bad news," she said as she settled down at the kitchen table. Something about a professor at the university involved in a harassment scandal. My heart skipped a beat. Gee, did they say who it was? I tried to keep my voice steady, dreading the answer. She shook her head. No, they didn't mention a name on the radio, but you know how these things go. It's probably all over the TV by now. Nodding, I turned on the television and tuned into the news. Sure enough, there was a report on the scandal. As I had feared, my father's face appeared on the screen. The anchor detailed the accusations against him, and I felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over me. Turning off the TV, I sat down heavily, trying to process the news. Brian came in, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw my face. "What's wrong, babe?" he asked, his brow furrowed in concern. I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. "It's my dad. He's been accused of harassing a student." Brian's expression grew serious for a moment before he came over and took my hand. "I'm sorry, Michelle. That's tough news. How do you want to handle this?" I shook my head, feeling unsure about everything. "I don't know. I mean, what can I even do? We're not close anymore." He squeezed my hand, showing he understood. "Whatever you need, I'm here for you. We don't have to figure it all out right now." I decided to wait and see how things unfolded before making any moves. Whatever decision I made, I knew Brian would be by my side, and that gave me the strength to face whatever came next. Life had been peaceful until that unexpected afternoon at work, when a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. I hadn't seen my parents in a long time, and the sight of them stirred up a mix of emotions I thought I had put to rest. They both looked dramatically different. The scandal had taken its toll. Mom had lost a lot of weight and looked much older, while Dad seemed broken, a shadow of the stern man he once was. My mother saw me and rushed over, arms open, as if nothing had happened, as if years of distance and disapproval could be erased in an instant. But I couldn't embrace her, not now. Instead, I stepped back and took Brian's hand, drawing strength from his presence. "Michelle, it was so hard to find you," Mom said, her voice cracking with emotion. Dad, always the blunt one, got straight to the point, his voice harsh and bitter. "I was accused unfairly, you know. I went to your sister's husband for help, but that leech wanted a fortune. Your sister sided with him, and now they've kicked us out. We need your help." I stared at them, disbelief and anger swirling inside me. "Help? After all these years you show up and demand help? You have nowhere else to go?" "We thought maybe we could stay with you," Mom said desperately. "They've disowned us too." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Stay with me? After you disowned me, you made it clear I wasn't your daughter anymore." Dad's face turned red, his old temper flaring up. "You owe us, Michelle, after all we've done for you." "That's where you're wrong," I replied, feeling a newfound resolve. I cut them off, feeling Brian squeeze my hand for support. "I don't owe you anything. You threw me out because I chose my happiness over your demands. And now you want to just move in and act like we're a family again?" The situation was spiraling out of control, and I could see people watching, a small crowd beginning to form. Mom started to cry, her sobs loud and drawing even more attention. "You're being ungrateful. After everything we've done for you," she accused through her tears. I took a deep breath, my decision clear. "No, Mom. I'm not ungrateful. I'm free and happy. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." As we walked away, I heard my dad yelling, but Brian leaned over and quietly told the security team, "Don't let them come here again." The following months flew by, filled with love and peace. We welcomed a son, a new beginning for our growing family. My parents never came back. That day in the parking lot was the last time I saw them. While part of me grieved for what could have been, I knew I had made the right choice for myself and for my family. I had finally found my own path, a path that led to a life filled with love, freedom, and genuine happiness. It wasn't the life my parents had envisioned for me, but it was the life I was meant to live, a life of my own choosing. Story 2. As soon as I entered the home, I should have known something was up. In contrast to the typical arguments between my husband Vincent and his son Benny, the quietness seemed odd and excessively quiet. Attracted by the faint sound of conversations, I walked into the study, my stomach churning. It's the ideal remedy. She won't have any suspicions. Although Vincent's voice was low, it was brimming with icy assurance. I held my breath as I leaned closer to the door, my pulse pounding. Then Benny's voice came, piercing and calculated. "Do you think this poison will be effective?" Slowly. "Before we can access her assets. I don't want her to pass away too soon." My blood grew chilly as I froze. To prevent myself from gasping aloud, my hand shot to my lips. As I tried to make sense of the terrifying things I had just heard, my mind raced. They were preparing to kill me and were conspiring against me. I was so terrified by the discovery that I was immobilized. The doorknob turned abruptly. Vincent stepped forward, and I leaped back, gasping for air. Upon seeing me, his eyes narrowed momentarily before a horrible smirk twisted his lips. "There you are, my love," he murmured with ease. I was just talking to Benny about some business. His words themselves were poison. So nonchalant but so dishonest. Benny trailed behind him, his icy, calculating eyes scanning me like a predator assessing its victim. "Is everything okay?" With a tone of phony concern, Vincent inquired. I felt a chill go down my spine when he put a clammy hand on my shoulder. "You appear quite pallid." Fear and hatred raced inside me, but I forced myself to remain cool and swallowed hard. My thoughts cried out for me to run, and my chest felt constricted, but I was able to control myself. I lied in a tight voice. "I'm fine." I tried to disguise the insanity that was brewing inside of me by forcing a feeble grin. "I am feeling a little dizzy. That's all." Vincent's forehead wrinkled. "Acting as though you care." He led me to the kitchen and said, "Why don't you sit down and have some water? I'll prepare a meal for you." I felt a new surge of fear at what he said. Did they have this in mind? Now was he going to poison me? My mind was buzzing with all the possible outcomes, and the hairs on the back of my neck sprang up. Could their selfishness and desire for money truly drive them this far? My own household. The thought was nearly unbearable. Silently, I saw Vincent moving around the counter as though nothing were amiss. I looked at Benny, and his easygoing demeanor was like a kick in the face. Like a predator observing its prey, his eyes were fixed on me, calculating and cold. I got a shiver from that expression. However, it also ignited something within me, a fire. It burned steadily and powerfully, a resolve that I would not allow them to prevail. I refused to become their victim. They would get a fight if they so desired. I held on to the water glass. Vincent handed me, looking directly into his eyes. He didn't appear to realize that I was silently challenging him with my gaze. He was blinded by his conceit. With the same nauseating smile, he replied, "Drink up, sweetheart. You'll quickly feel better." Though my thoughts were racing, I brought the glass to my lips. I would give them a war if they want one. Until their devious scheme failed and justice was done, I wouldn't stop. I became a silent watcher in the days that followed, paying close attention to anything that may be of use. Benny and Vincent pretended that nothing was wrong. However, their composure only strengthened my resolve. My first glimmer of optimism came from my dearest friend, Julia. I eventually told her what I had heard over coffee one day. I let the words flow out of me, a mixture of anger, anxiety, and incredulity. She remained composed even though her eyes expanded in disbelief. "Gabriel, we need proof," she stated firmly. "We must make a strong argument if we want to stop them." She was correct. Without evidence, I was unable to face them. I required a strategy. I began looking over our money with new eyes that night. The details of their treachery gradually became clear. Missing money. Suspicious transactions. Bet paid hidden debts. Their deception started to fall apart. One evening at supper, Vincent saw that I was concentrating on the financial statements. "Those figures appear to interest you a lot." Although I could sense the strain in his voice, he spoke nonchalantly. "Discover something intriguing." I looked him in the eye. I'm careful not to display my roiling rage. I'm only cleaning up my finances. I gave a fair response. He raised his eyebrows in a mocking astonishment. Then he shrugged and resumed his meal, feigning indifference. His lack of interest just strengthened my resolve. In the weeks that followed, I mastered the art of concealing my genuine motivations. I stayed at home and feigned illness in order to learn more about their plots. Every dodgy trade, every dubious transaction, all of them were recorded. Through it all, Julio was my pillar of support, giving me guidance and maintaining my concentration. One evening, as we went over the mounting evidence, she commented, "We're getting closer. We'll have all we need to defeat them soon." Vincent's arrogant demeanor just strengthened my determination. Did he truly believe I wouldn't defend myself? I would ensure that his conceit would be the cause of his demise. Vincent was completely mistaken if he believed that I was a helpless, inexperienced lady, incapable of unraveling his web of falsehoods. Benny, though, was the one who really made me shiver. He was not subtle in his loathing. It was unavoidable, cold, and stinging. In those dead eyes, his hatred blazed, and his glares were filled with disdain. "Better. Be mindful of your back." "I wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen," he mumbled one day as he walked by me in the corridor, his tone brimming with hatred. Just a reminder of the poison coursing through their veins. The danger wasn't even veiled. They had a disgusting, deadly, and daily deepening hate. However, I had no intention of being intimidated by them. I wasn't a weak lady who would give up to their demands. No, that was not me. I was stronger, resurrected, even motivated by a desire for fairness. With Julia's support, I was prepared to fight back. They had put so much effort into hiding the lies, and I was determined to reveal them. Just as they had intended to ruin me, I would tear down all they had constructed, piece by piece. The day will come when their treachery would be exposed, and I wouldn't be afraid when that day arrived. I would be prepared with an unwavering, icy vow of retaliation. I performed my duty precisely each day. I turned into the ideal representation of a weak, ill wife, someone they wouldn't consider dangerous. I was able to remain undetected as I worked to bring them down thanks to my act. During breakfast one day, Vincent said, "You look extra pale this morning." He didn't care, despite the phony worry in his voice. He kept eating, hardly even looking at me. Feeling a little exhausted lately, I answered with a forced little smile. He dismissed me with a shrug. "Rest up then. This weekend is the Benson event, and I can't let you make me look bad in front of prospective customers." His condescending remarks were a smack in the face. To prevent myself from lashing back at him, I gritted my teeth. It wouldn't assist my plans if I lost my anger. I had to play along and maintain my composure. I threw myself even more into my performance in the days that followed. I walked slower, allowed my energy seem to ebb, and kept up the look of someone too unwell to be a danger. "You appear to be warmed by death." Then one afternoon, when I padded into the living room, he scoffed. With a weary moan, I collapsed onto the couch. That stomach infection must be the cause. I gave him a weary glance in response. Benny's expression contorted in barely concealed disdain. He whispered something to himself, something mean, and as soon as he was gone, he rushed out of the room. I briefly removed my mask. My mind was constantly planning what I would do next. I was going to ensure that their conceit would be the cause of their demise. I let my act slide for just a second, a grim smile pulling at my lips. If only Benny and Vincent understood the reality of my weak appearance. My goal was to give them the impression that I was weak, and I did this with every cough and exhausted sigh. Harmless, and poses no risk to their plans. I concentrated on defending what was rightfully mine as the weeks went by. I began arranging arrangements through Julia's reliable sources and transferring money covertly with her assistance. They were preparing a new identity, with new papers and a clean record. I would have a way out of this nightmare when the time came. During one of our private discussions, Julia murmured, "You've got to hang in there." There was a mixture of concern and resolve in her eyes. "We're nearly there." I nodded, maintaining my flimsy facade while hunching my shoulders. "Don't be concerned about me," I said gently. "Just make sure everything is ready when the time arrives." Her jaw clenched and she gave me a hard nod before departing, the weight of what we were planned hanging heavy between us. At home, I saw Vincent and Benny getting colder by the day. Their sneers and harsh words had faded into stillness, yet their occasional disdainful looks told it all. Did they think I was planning something? Or were they simply waiting for the appropriate opportunity to get rid of me and seize what they believed was theirs? The notion fueled my rage, making me more eager than ever to bring them down. The night before the Benson event finally came. It signaled the start of the next phase of my strategy. Vincent looked at me as I sat at the dinner table, his face a mixture of feigned worry and displeasure. "Well," he replied in a tone full with contempt, "you certainly don't look fit to attend tomorrow's event. You might be better off not doing this, sweetie. You shouldn't murder over in front of everyone, would you?" His delight was hardly concealed, as his lips formed a smug smirk. I turned my head away, feigning fatigue to cover my face. He probably believed I was vanquished, weakened by his dominance. However, I felt at ease within, too quiet. The stillness before the storm was this. A feeling of sickness swept over me in the few minutes before I shattered his delusions of control. I researched myself. Everything would be different tomorrow, and they wouldn't have anticipated it. I took a deep breath to stabilize myself and put my shaking palms against the table's edge. They were mistaken to believe they had broken my body and soul. The sun would rise and everything would be different. Benny and Vincent would come to understand that their brutality had only sparked an unimaginable power. My act of weakness was solidly established. I needed to proceed to the next phase of my strategy. They believed I had no influence, but they were going to see how destructive their own conceit could be. To give the impression that Vincent was having an affair, I began out small by leaving minor hints. Spoken phone conversations when he thought no one was looking, a speck of red lipstick on a shirt collar, and a subtle smell of strange cologne on his clothing. They didn't notice at first, but I knew that patience was essential. The seeds of mistrust I had sown started to sprout slowly. Benny was the one who eventually lost it. He became furious one evening and aggressively attacked Vincent. "Who is she?" I jumped as Benny yelled and slammed his fist so hard on the table. "Try not to refute it at all. I've witnessed the evidence." Vincent's countenance was a mixture of amazement and bewilderment as his eyes expanded. "Boy, what on earth are you talking about?" he barked. "The lipstick stains, the covert phone conversations." Benny spit, accusingly harsh in his voice. Leaning forward, he gave his father a vile glare. "You're not being faithful to us, are you? A cheap fling." For a split second, I thought I saw guilt flash in Vincent's eyes as his jaw tightened, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of outrage. "You have no right to accuse me of such a thing." With a yell, Vincent slammed both hands on the table, causing the silverware and dishes to clatter. "I've provided you with a comfortable life, a house, and an education, and you pay me back like this." They started yelling at one another, their words full of blame and rage. There was mayhem, a flurry of denials and allegations. I silently sat back and observed the growing distance between them. I had carefully planned this moment, and it was now playing out just as I had imagined. I had created the conditions for their demise, like a scientist meticulously combining volatile substances. All I had to do now was allow their tension to grow and fester. I had set the scenario carefully, presenting the parts of chaos, and then stepped back to watch it emerge. In the days that followed, Vincent and Benny's mistrust had inevitably exploded. There was an oppressive tension between them. It was difficult for them to gaze at one another without sarcastic remarks. Thinly disguised accusations peppered their discussions. "Why did you stay up so late last night?" One morning during breakfast, Benny lost his temper and glared at his father with a steel-piercing glare. Vincent slammed his coffee mug on the table and grumbled, out taking care of business. Steaming coffee spilled over the edge due to the impact. "Boy, watch what you say. What I've given up for this family is beyond your comprehension." The more days went by, the louder and more ugly their disputes became. I let the building hostility wash over me like music and stopped focusing on the details. I had carefully sowed the seeds of mistrust, creating this symphony of chaos, and now I saw them annihilate one another in a rage-filled crescendo. The results were even better than I had imagined. With their relationship in shreds, it was time for the next phase in my strategy. a final deed to drive them over the brink. I waited patiently and silent as the tension between them thickened. All I needed was the perfect moment, the right spark to ignite the fire that would consume them both, and I would be prepared when the time came. During supper one evening, the chance came up. The air was thick with bitterness, the silence broken only by the clatter of cutlery and the occasional hostile glare or muttered insult exchanged between Vincent and Benny. Clearing my throat, I forced myself to look small and frail, twisting my hands nervously in my lap. Both of them turned to me, their faces filled with annoyance. "I regret to inform you of some concerning information," I said quietly, allowing my voice to waver. Vincent narrowed his eyes ominously. "Get rid of it," he said sharply. "Stop wasting our time." With a trembling breath, I stoked my uneasiness. "It's about." I swallowed hard and paused, as if I was having trouble speaking. "The other lady is the subject." It came out like a bomb. Anger and distrust simmered in the air. Vincent leaped to his feet. Outrage twisted his face. Benny leaned in front. His eyes were shining with a sense of vindication triumph. "You lying, cheating bastard!" Benny spat, his voice dripping with venom. The room erupted into chaos. Benny began a barrage of charges as Vincent yelled, his rage trembling the walls themselves. The anger between them, which I had so deliberately nurtured, eventually boiled over. Knowing that the last act had begun, I sat peacefully in the maelstrom I had caused. I would see it through to the very conclusion, since this was the moment I had been waiting for. "I was aware that you were seeing someone else," I remarked, using a single move to rip through my calm voice. A rumpled picture was slipped across the table by me. It was one that I had orchestrated, so that it seemed like Vincent was in a precarious situation. As he grasped it, his brows wrinkled in uncertainty, but his countenance soon twisted into a wrath. He yelled this while smashing the picture into the table with such force that it trembled. "It's a lie, a perverse, malevolent untruth. Is it?" It would explain so much, so I inquired in a hushed, almost painful tone. "Your late evenings, the hidden phone calls and that peculiar perfume I keep smelling." Benny sprang to his feet, his fists clenched hard, his face a mask of rage. He said, "You arrogant, self-righteous bastard!" and moved closer to his father. "You have been unfaithful the entire time, have you not? Lying to us and continuing with some cheap fling?" Everything occurred so quickly. With a howl of rage, Vincent sprang at Benny. As they battled and swore, the two of them fell to the ground, limbs flailing and fists flying. The room reverberated with the sound of their battle, savage and unadulterated. I remained sat and saw the mayhem. Allow them to distinguish one another. I let the venom I had stoked to devour them both, I thought. Only fair, it felt. They would use the same poison they had spit at me to harm themselves, since they had based their entire existence on cruelty and dishonesty. Benny was ultimately overwhelmed by Vincent, who choked him and pinned him to the ground. Benny's face went crimson under the strain, and his fangs were exposed as his face twisted in a primitive rage. Torn between disgust and delight, I watched. I was going to do this. Every action and every step had brought Benny to this point, where his eyes widened and his breathing grew frantic. At last, I made a move. Reaching for my phone, I pressed the record button. I decided to let them complete their vicious battle, allow them to show who they really are. I would capture every second of their collapse. They were lying splayed on the floor, gasping for oxygen and battered, when the violence suddenly ended. The dining area was a battle zone of smashed furniture and shattered dignity. As a result of their anger, they glared at one another with genuine, undiluted contempt. The seriousness of what they had done appeared to strike them both for a brief moment. I put the phone in my pocket and let out a dry, bitter laugh. It was finished. The situation had played out just as I had anticipated. "Well," I answered, maintaining a calm tone of voice despite the boiling emotional tempest inside of me. A storm fed by years of suffering and resentment. That performance was impressive. You two have, in my opinion, given me good reason to reconsider my will. My voice was sharp but calm as I spoke. For the first time, I noticed a glimmer of uncertainty on their features as their eyes met mine. Let them ponder. With sickening delight, I thought. Now that the game was underway, there would only be survivors, no winners. Following their violent altercation, quiet descended upon the home like an ominous fog. Vincent and Benny went along the corridors awkwardly, avoiding one another. Like predators licking their wounds, they were tamed. I remained in the background, silent but alert, waiting for the ideal opportunity to attack once more. With Julia's support, I had already set the next stage of my plan in motion. The first step came in the form of a call from Dr. Austin, our family doctor. When I arrived to his office, I leaned heavily on Julia's arm, playing the part of a fragile, ill lady barely holding herself together. Dr. Austin welcomed me with a look of anxiety etched across his face. "The test findings, I'm afraid, are not good." His voice was solemn as he said. I pretend to be shocked as I expand my eyes. "What are you saying? What's the matter?" My voice trembled as I asked. He shook his head and moaned. He had a solemn look. "Your problem appears to be more severe than we first believed. I'm so sorry." Suffocating and thick, the words hung in the air. Julia, always the conspirator, drew close to me while feigning sadness. I kept my expression neutral by biting my lip, but I secretly felt a twinge of delight. All of this was planned. It was a well-crafted falsehood meant to lead Vincent and Benny farther into the trap. Naturally, Dr. Austin was unaware that he was a pawn in my scheme. For an instant, I nearly felt bad for taking advantage of him since his anxiety and remorse were sincere. Nearly. However, it was not the moment for pity. Not quite yet. Julia sniffed next to me as Vincent and Benny were summoned to the doctor's office to pretend to hear about my illness, and their responses were precisely what I had anticipated. Her performance was flawless. Their expressions were inscrutable and icy as they sat rigidly. Their expressions lacked any hint of worry or sympathy. "What's the prognosis?" Vincent said angrily, gazing at Dr. Austin. "Go ahead and do it." The physician let out a sigh and massaged his temples as though the stress of the situation were too much to bear. Vincent's tone remained steady, but his hesitancy was real. No hesitancy, no kindness, pure, self-centered apathy. The ease with which they were producing this for me was almost comical. They didn't know what was going to happen. Dr. Austin's tone was heavy with finality as he remarked, "I'm afraid the situation is quite serious. According to the tests, Gabriel's illness is terminal and developing far more quickly than we had thought." There was a heavy, oppressive hush in the room. I maintained a low glance, watching Vincent and Benny's faces through half-closed lashes to see how they were responding to my disappointment. Their faces were still as unintelligible as rock. Until I intentionally calmed them, they sat rigidly, their faces expressionless and icy. I allowed the tension to be broken by my voice. Considering the situation, my voice trembled just enough to seem real as I spoke gently. "I've made the decision to amend my will." With instant effect, Vincent's eyes narrowed like a predator's as his head swung toward me. "Oh," he murmured sharply, his voice brimming with phony tenderness. "And what specific adjustments are you making, my love?" I doubled over for dramatic effect and coughed a weak rattling sound. Pale and wobbly, I straightened and held onto Julia's arm for balance. A little quiver of Vincent's jaw revealed the tempest that was building behind his composed exterior. "My whole estate," I continued, my voice growing louder as I met their gaze. "Following my passing, both will be bequeathed to the Amnesty International Foundation." The ensuing hush was deafening. The weight of what I said seemed to make the air in the room disappear. They were startled and pallid as the blood drained from their faces, and I watched with silent enjoyment. They had been treating me as a stepping stone to money for years. Now that their schemes have been thwarted, they have an easy way to achieve their self-centered goals. They sat still, confused, and exposed. It was flawless. Their astonishment and perplexity served as the precursor to the spectacular conclusion I had been preparing all along. This vile theater of deception and treachery would explode with a few more movements. The mood in the house darkened further in the days that followed. Like a dense, stifling cloud, resentment and despair pervaded the atmosphere. Benny and Vincent moved like animals in a corner. They moved erratically and jitterily. They avoided me as much as they avoided each other. With every day that goes by, their paranoia increases. I watched them crumble from a safe distance. Whatever remaining serenity they had was eroded by their greed, rage, and terror. They were unaware that the plot to bring them down was being planned there in front of them. They were getting closer to the inevitable finish with each step, and I was prepared to see it all happen. Now that I had suffered every injury they caused, I could plainly see the results on their faces. Their previously arrogant self-confidence had given way to dread and desperation. Their emotions occasionally erupted into excessive fury, and they would yell accusations and smash furniture as though doing so would somehow make their collapsing plans go away. They withdrew to their corners as the storms passed, perhaps planning fresh strategies to restore authority. "You are a cunning witch." One morning, Vincent roared and slammed his fist so forcefully on the kitchen counter that the plates clattered. "Isn't this your retaliation? At last, revealing your actual self." I gave him a blank gaze, my pallid face revealing nothing. His feet were heavy with rage as he rushed around the kitchen island. The smell of perspiration and booze clung to him up close, unpleasant and oppressive without a word. I walked out of the room after turning around. To keep my look of weakness, I walked slowly and deliberately. Let him shout and be angry. I was no longer able to feel his rage. The worse my alleged illness got, the more heinous Vincent and Benny's actions became. With a ferocity that could have rattled anybody else, they yelled profanities and flung items. But Julia was my rock no matter what. Her constant presence and sage counsel protected me from the poisonous maelstrom engulfing me. One evening, as we sat in the guest room listening to another quarrel break out between Vincent and Benny on the other side of the door, she murmured, "Stay the course. Gabriel, things are disintegrating. It's visible to you." She was correct. Their eyes flared, and their faces were carved with despair. Even though I detested what they had done to me, I couldn't help but feel twisted delight for all of their brutality and callousness. They were only avaricious scavengers. Now that they had lost the prize of my riches, they were revealing who they really were. It became evident that they would do whatever it took to achieve their goals. Untrustworthy colleagues started showing in at strange hours, their whispered chats with Vincent and Benny interspersed with sly looks at me. Even though I couldn't always understand what they were saying, there was always a sense of urgency in those conversations. I detected something more sinister than avarice at the core of their schemes. Money was no longer the only factor. It has to do with power. The innate will to rule and regain authority at all costs. Their increasing desperation made them willing to go to any lengths, no matter how heinous. I saw their looks lingering on me many times. Something wild and calculating entered their gaze. However, I maintained my composure because I knew that their unraveling would soon come to a head. My strategy was coming together, and their increasing insanity just made it more likely that they would fail. Upon returning after a trip with Julia, I could clearly see how desperate they were. All of my belongings had been sifted through, jewelry boxes left open, drawers left open, and papers all over the place. They had encroached on every square inch of my private area in an attempt to find anything that would violate the conditions of my will. Maybe they believed they would discover a way around it, or perhaps they were so enraged by my possessions that they just looted them. In any case, I recognized their behavior for what it was, the last, frantic thrashing of guys who were aware of their doom. Their desperate actions only served to tighten the noose around their necks, speeding up the inevitable. Before long, they wouldn't have anything left to grab onto. No more plots. No more self-destructive actions, and I would be waiting until that time, all set to deal the ultimate blow to their entitled naiveties. Since karma had already started the process, I was happy to observe and wait for the time being. I had discovered that the best reckonings come from the patient, steady hand of fate, rather than from haste. The day of reckoning came with an almost normal quiet, rather than a flurry of commotion. At one point, Vincent and Benny were standing in front of me, yelling curses and threats like untamed beasts. Their words were brimming with hate. The next door behind me opened, and a large number of police enforcement personnel entered the room. Grayson, Benny, Vincent, and Grayson. A rough-voiced announcement sliced like a razor through the confusion. "Both of you are under arrest." The room was silent for a moment. Time itself seemed to have halted. Then the mayhem broke out again. "This is absurd!" Vincent's normally smooth and composed voice broke with incredulity. "For what reasons? Deception, coercion, attempted homicide." The lead officer gave a stern response. He gave me a quick look, and we both silently agreed. As we examined the data, I have no doubt that the list will expand. They appeared to be crushed under the weight of the charges. Benny and Vincent contracted in front of me, their haughtiness and pride dissipating. The haughty bullies who had harassed me were no more. They suddenly resembled frightened, huddled creatures, reduced to nothing more than spoiled kids caught in the act. Benny screamed at me, his untamed, savage eyes staring at me, his face contorted in anger as he fought the cop holding him back. "This is your fault, you nasty person." With a hard hand on his chest, the officer jerked him back, interrupting the last of his poisonous comment. As he was pulled into submission, his voice turned into a furious roar. As the situation played out in front of me, I remained still and maintained a composed demeanor. The once strong guys who had attempted to bring me down were now helpless, their lives falling apart in public view. Although this wasn't the wild, blazing conclusion I had envisioned, it was ideal in its calm, deliberate manner. Finally, their reckoning had arrived, and there was no way out. As Vincent and Benny were pulled from my house, their limbs thrashing in futile resistance, I stood still, unmoved. Their intensely hateful glares attempted to break through my composed demeanor. However, I felt nothing. No wrath, no fear, no sympathy. Just a profound feeling of release or closure. The poison that had been in my life for so long seemed to be finally being thrown out. They had vanished. The gloomy darkness they had placed over my life vanished with them. Julia emerged from the corner and put a soft touch on my shoulder as the mayhem subsided. With a comforting embrace, she said, "It's over, Gabriel. They are no longer with you." Even though her words hardly registered, I nodded as the gravity of what had just transpired started to weigh on me. In like a tsunami, rushing, it was finished. The nightmare was ended. In the most poetic fashion possible, justice had been done. But even as I stood there, I didn't experience any tremendous happiness or a victorious triumph. There was nothing but a gap where their poisonous presence had been. As they went through the residence, the officials meticulously gathered and recorded the evidence. I had spent months compiling all of the information about Vincent and Ben's wrongdoings, which revealed financial scams, fraud, and, most damning of all, their devious attempt to poison me and take away all I had fought so hard to get. With every new discovery, I felt as though the heavy responsibilities I had been carrying for so long were finally letting go. The home felt unusually silent, almost weightless. Once the detectives had done their task and gone, I felt at peace for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, as though I had been released from unseen bonds. Dr. Austin showed up later that night. Anxiety and doubt were engraved on his features. There was no mistaking the shame in his eyes. He had come to the realization that he had been a piece in a far bigger game. He found it difficult to find the correct words as he entered. His voice cracked as he said, "Gabriel, I don't know what to say." I held out my hand as I realized the truth. Making a simple motion, he cut him off. "Calm down, Julian. Don't worry about it. You are only an instrument." His expression wavered between relief and anguish. However, I had no desire to alleviate his guilt. It was finished. He had fulfilled his part. The chapter was over. After the poison subsided, I was able to reclaim my life. I apologize for involving you, but I explained that it was essential. I spoke in a stern yet calm tone. With my words taking hold, Dr. Austin swallowed hard. As he came to terms with the reality, I could see the stress gradually releasing from his body. "Is that accurate?" His voice was firm, yet hushed as he inquired, a glimmer of insight piercing his previous bewilderment. All of this was part of a scheme to reveal them and their transgressions. I stood with a little grin on my lips, a fresh sense of purpose and power. Women must defend themselves. Julian, you must be able to comprehend that. I said my goodbyes and walked out of the room, leaving the character I had been playing for so long behind. There was no sign of the frail, duped woman. After shedding that skin, I began a new chapter in my life that was devoid of falsehoods and brimming with opportunities. I stopped to take it all in as I strode out into my sunny acreage. As if the burden of my past had finally been removed, the air seemed different and lighter. A fresh morning was breaking, and I was prepared to welcome it wholeheartedly. After being freed from the bonds of a past I shouldn't have had to live, my life was once more mine. I was able to start afresh now, more resilient and resolute than before.